You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Here's our conversation with University of Minnesota professor Keith Mays on the significance of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Keith Mays is an associate professor of African American and African Studies at the University of Minnesota. Professor Mays, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Let's talk about what that bill included and how these laws helped protect African Americans.
So the act was passed on July 2nd, 1964, and it had 10 sections to it, but the three most important sections, Section 3, which dealt with public accommodations, which meant that segregation in all public facilities controlled by the state, segregation was outlawed. Racism, as we knew it for the last 80 to 90 years prior to, was no longer permissible in the public, in the Southern public. So that was Title 3. Title 4 was 10 titles, but Title 3, Title 6, and Title 7. Title 6 said that no discrimination within institutions that receive federal dollars. And of course, Title 7 dealt with equal employment opportunities. So although 10 sections long, the three most important titles sort of really struck a blow to Jim Crow as we knew it up until 1964.
At that time, the African American community and its leaders had to deal with a primarily white and male Congress and President Kennedy, and of course President Johnson, who succeeded him. How did the leaders of the African American community work with these people in Washington to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 enacted?
That's a very good question. I think that to really understand the Civil Rights Act of 64, you kind of have to rewind back 1 year, 1963. The pivotal month in 1963 for the Civil Rights Movement was April. April was when Birmingham exploded, but when Martin Luther King Jr. came to town, he really galvanized the movement locally. Now here's the thing about 63 April that's important. Once the media got involved, after those first 2 weeks in April, Birmingham becomes a national phenomenon. Birmingham then turns to the whole question of how are the sort of the local rights of African Americans in Alabama? How do they resonate with other African Americans, not only in the region of the South, but in the United States? When President Kennedy makes his famous speech, his first speech on civil rights, it is in early June. So it's about 4 to 6 weeks after Birmingham explodes. So the conversation now turns to legislation. How do we actually make this a reality for African Americans writ large in the country? So the conversation and the legislation begins in June of 1963 when Kennedy makes that first speech. He makes a speech to the NAACP, and then he also makes a speech to the nation in June of 1963. So that gets the ball rolling.
In practice, how did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 help protect the rights of African Americans during the latter part of the 1960s?
There is immediate dividends to the act. African Americans are now able to go to restaurants, go to hotels, go to inside and participate in the Southern economy in ways that they never had before. African Americans are able to now go to white schools. There's another piece of the legislation that dealt with the desegregation of public schools. Now you say that, well, I thought that the Brown decision took care of that. No, the southern states were so recalcitrant in denying African American children the right to enter white schools, they had to actually put that in the Civil Rights Act of 64. So immediately you see southern schools beginning to admit black students for the first time, almost 10 years after the Brown decision. So it begins to pay immediate dividends, and that would be similarly true with the Voting Rights Act of 65. Blacks would begin to register after the act is signed into law the next year.
How well does the Civil Rights Act of 1964 work today, 50 years later?
Oh, well, the impact cannot be gainsaid. I mean, in many ways, no discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, color, religion, and then sex is added to it. It encapsulated so many different grassroots movements, for grassroots struggles for equal rights. The mere fact that you can, when you go to a job now and you fill out a job application and you see that those words, those magic words written at the end of the application that says no discrimination on the basis of color, creed. I mean, it's still there. The fine print is still there. That institution, that corporations can't discriminate. That universities cannot discriminate against people. We've added other aggrieved groups over the years, disabilities. So the disabilities movement gets folded in to this act. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has been so expansive in that it has come to include other groups that were not really necessarily part of the earliest struggles in the 50s and the 60s. And so we're better off for it as a country. And that will continue to be so in terms of how flexible the legislation actually is in the 21st century. So it continues to be flexible to include others.
More of our conversation with African American Studies professor Keith Mays when Access Minnesota returns.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.